Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah.
Are we ready to go? Oh, yeah. We're
Yep.
It's very exciting.
Hello.
Doesn't have to be me.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as they are focused.
Yep. Cool.
Okay, can I just-
So, thanks, man. Thank you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Flinders University Library event. We are pleased to host Professor Tara Brabazon and Dr. Christine Feldman-Barrett in discussion about Christine's new book, A Women's History of the Beatles. I'm Prashant Pandey, Director of Library Services here at Flinders, and I'm delighted to host this event at the campus at Flinders University. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Ghana people, on which we are hosting this event, and we pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of the nation upon which Flinders operate. Flinders University Library is a critical enabler for our students and our research community across all disciplines. We are absolutely passionate about this opportunity to engage with our students, our researchers, and the wider community. We are also in O Week and middle of the French Festival here at Adelaide, which is awash with the vibrancy and colors of the yearly celebration of art, performance, and culture. Flinders Bedford Park campus is also abuzz with music stalls, performances, new students touring the grounds and dreaming of their research careers and getting ready for the new lives as students and researchers here at Flinders. In continuation of this spirit, today's event is part of an informal series of presentations we are running in the library, and we are excited to have two wonderful members of the research community to join us to share their passion for research. Today, we are in for an extra special event. We are joining by my favorite, Professor Tara Brabazon, our Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders, in conversation with Dr. Christine Feldman-Barrett, here to talk to us about postgraduate research, publishing, academia, beyond the university, youth culture, women, and of course the Beatles. Knowing Professor Tara Brabazon, I'm not sure where the discussion will progress, but I can't wait for the event to start. Today is also a very special day. Mary pointed that out to me. Today is the birthday of the quiet Beatle, George Harrison. What an excellent timing. Or I should say, what an excellent planning on part of Mary and Liz for picking up the excellent date for this talk. George and I share something important. We both love the culture of India. And one of the only non-Indian pictures which is hanging in my ancestral home is of George Harrison. My parents are very big fan, not because of the Western music side of things, but their fanatic passion for Pandit Ravi Shankar. And George spent an incredible amount of time. And the picture that I was referring to had sitar rather than a guitar, which is an Indian musical instrument. So I'm really pleased that today's topic is Beatle and a twist to it, women's perspective and the intersection, how women engaged or have been able to move with the times using the Beatles as the cultural icon. Now, coming back to the event at hand, a brief introduction of our guests. Professor Tara Brabazon is Dean of Graduate Research and Professor of Cultural Studies here at Flinders. Her research interests include city imaging, creative industries, cultural studies, physical cultural studies, digitization, and higher education studies, and she is the author of 19 books and over 240 refereed articles and counting. She has also championed close to 300 video blogs to educate and inform audiences to the different aspects of research. More importantly, in the context of today's presentation, Tara is a passionate advocate for open access, not just the printed word, but also in her commitment to open access sound and vision in the form of podcasts and videos to widen the dissemination of research. Indeed, she has inspired many of her graduate students to follow this path in their own publishing journey, and we look forward to hearing from Tara as she shares her story today. Dr. Christine Feldman-Barrett is an American scholar. Welcome to Adelaide. Based in Brisbane, Australia, while her scholarship is interdisciplinary, bridging sociology with cultural history and media studies, She is a senior lecturer in sociology at Griffith University. Her work focuses on the histories of popular music and culture, youth culture from the 1960s to 1990s. She's also a member of the Griffith Center for Social and Cultural Research, the Subculture Networks, and the International Association for the Study of Popular Music. Her latest book, A Women's History of the Beatles, follows We Are the Mods, a transnational history of the youth subculture, which was the first academic book to examine this British-born phenomenon. She is also the editor of Lost Histories of Youth Culture and has published in edited collections as well as in academic journals such as Popular Music and Society, the Journal of Youth Studies, Feminist Media Studies, and Space and Culture. Additionally, Dr. Feldman-Barrett has been featured as an expert commentator on ABC, Radio Australia, and in the BBC documentary Mods and Rockers Rebooted. Without further ado, I'm pleased to hand over to Tara. Over to you, Tara.
Prashant, you are a legend. You are my favourite librarian in the universe, and my other favourite librarians in the universe also happen to be in this room. So you've got great company. And I'm so thrilled to be a part of this event today. And look, it's been a tough year. Hi, everybody. It's been a tough year. And isn't it great? Isn't it powerful? Isn't it productive to do something significant in research and talk about ideas once more? Let's today have a Chardonnay for everyone that's at that time of the day. Pour yourself a bit of a Cardi, have a bit of a Savvy, or have a nice hot cup of coffee if you're in Canada, and see how we go. So look, colleagues, welcome to the session that we've titled today, The Beatles, Women and Me, crafting the second academic book. Now we need to thank the wonderful Liz, the wonderful Mary, who just is a miracle worker, and the extraordinary Prashant for their commitment to ideas, to research, but also to the book. And we're very, very fortunate to have Christine with us today for what I hope will be an inspiring story, a story about research against the odds, a story about research against the grain, and an inspirational story, I think, about how to change the world through a book in difficult times. And look, I also wanted to do a big wave to all our friends out there on the live stream from around the world. We know of at least 11 countries that are part of the live stream, so we're absolutely thrilled to welcome you today on what would have been George Harrison's 78th birthday. And there's something quite meaningful, as Prashant has already talked about today, Norwegian wood. So hi to all the Beatles crew that are joining us, hi to all the popular cultural scholars out there that are joining us, and hi to everyone who's interested in creating a research career after a PhD is completed. So Christina, I'm thrilled. And look, I wanted to start this conversation, if I can, about your PhD and your first book. So can you tell us about how the PhD became the first book? So it became We Are the Mods, great book, which I could recommend to you. Now, that book was published in 2009. So could you tell us about that transition from the PhD to that first scholarly monograph?
Right. Well, my supervisor, or advisor as we call them back in the States, a wonderful man, Ronald J. Zabore, University of Pittsburgh, and he's a media historian. And when I told him that it was always my intention to have the PhD be a book, and I also managed to get a contract for it prior, or maybe I can't quite remember now, it might have been at the point where all the research had been done, I was starting to write chapters, but I was not even maybe midway through writing the dissertation or thesis. And I got the contract with Peter Lang, and Ron said to me, "You're going to write this as the book." So the chapters really were the chapters that went into the book. However, the actual thesis was about 500 pages plus 100 pages bibliography. So there was quite a bit of editing that went into turning it into the actual manuscript for the publisher. But that I just had that real vision and focus of always intending to turn the dissertation or the thesis into a book from the start, because I, again, felt that this was a topic that hadn't been written about in an academic way, and I wanted it to get out there as soon as possible. So it was really a fairly easy transition for me in terms of turning it into a book.
Brilliant. And for our students out there, and there are lots of students, thousands of PhD students out there, you can see the power of intentionality there. So with all our culture about commodifying, quick fix, get the research out quickly, Christine moved into her PhD wanting a book at the end, and that transformed how she was supervised and your intentionality. Now, I want to now ask a difficult question, because
Sure.
we know each other well.
Yes.
And so I did want to talk, and let's go nuggety, let's go tough. Prashant's
Okay.
used to me, so I'm going to go a bit rough and a bit crunchy as question 2. Question 1, thanks, let's now move on. Now, your second book has just been published
Yes.
by Bloomsbury Academic, a remarkable academic publisher, can I say, and it is titled A Woman's History of the Beatles. I recommend it to you. But before we talk about that book,
Sure.
I'm actually interested in the gap. Now, this is the important bit of this story. Tell us about being a lecturer, a senior lecturer in Australia between 2009
2011.
and, or 2011,
Yes.
thank you, and 2021. So that's a decade.
Yes.
Was this the difficult second album?
Mm.
What happened in those 10 years to make this the second book?
Okay, so first of all, I need to just bring everyone up to speed in terms of 2009 until I moved here in 2011.
Yes.
So out of the PhD, I took a fixed term position for 2 years at the University of New Hampshire, which I loved. I loved being there in the communication department. And the book had just come out. I'd had a great time in the PhD program at University of Pittsburgh. I was excited to start my career. It was also the global financial crisis, though, which really hit the United States quite hard. And so
Wow.
I took my job search in terms of a permanent position global. Clearly, that's why I ended up here, because I was applying for positions literally, I don't know how many countries, but all over the world, in Europe, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and I knew I would find a place. I knew I would end up somewhere, but I just didn't know where that would be. But I just stayed determined, stayed focused. I applied for lots of jobs through the whole time I was at University of New Hampshire. And then this opportunity came up where I saw the job at Griffith, and I wasn't sure. I thought, I don't know. I'm American. Why would they want to hire me and bring me here? And I just wasn't sure about the whole thing, but I thought, I'm putting my name in the hat. I'm going to see what happens. And all of a sudden, in September 2010, at some point, I got an email that I was a finalist, and they were going to fly me to Queensland to interview. So it was all very exciting, all just tremendously exciting. And so I had been really focused on the job hunt this whole time.
Yeah.
So I wasn't really publishing anything beyond the book that had already come out, and I had another book chapter. Everything went as well as could be expected. I was hired and I moved. I started in July 2011 at Griffith, and it was not, I think moving to a new country, new culture, I also met my now husband at that point. There were all these huge changes going
Husbands
on.
take time.
So it was as huge of a change as could be in many facets of my life. And so I think it took me longer than I thought to get used to university culture here, to get my bearings in terms of how things operate, what is teaching like, what is administration like, how does research happen here. And I just wanted to try different new things. So I decided I wanted to put out an edited collection. I had never been an editor for even a journal special issue. I thought I'd go for a book. I did that. It was populated by international scholars and authors. It was a really fun project to work on. I hadn't really gone into academic journal publishing because I'd been so focused on the book that I wanted to do some of that. I knew that I wanted to write another book, and I had a feeling it would be about the Beatles, but I didn't really get seriously focused on this project until 2016. I would say 2013 I started thinking about it seriously again. My sister, who we grew up as Beatles fans from childhood on, she encouraged me back in, I would say, 2005 or 6 when I was working on the dissertation still, the thesis. And so I revisited it about 2013. I still have the email I sent her that had a rough outline of what it would look like. And she had encouraged this idea of women's voices and foregrounding the female fan experience, but not just in the 60s, through the second and third generations of fans, because we were part of the second generation of fans. So I really have to thank my sister Mariana, who I think is watching. Hi, Mariana. And so that, but in earnest, it didn't really start happening in 2016, where I had research leave and I could actually go to London and Liverpool and start conducting interviews and going to the British Library and looking at Beatles Monthly and different magazines from that period. So that's how it happened. But it was really that, I would say the first 5 years here in Australia, it was such a transitional time for me. I really just, I would say in the last 4 or maybe 3 years, feel more at home and more at ease as a scholar and just a human being, you know, moving across the world and being in a totally new culture.
I don't know how many of you on this stream are incredibly moved by that. The cost and the consequences of the precariat workforce for international higher education you're seeing there, and the cost and consequences of that workforce on research you're seeing there. This remarkable woman with incredible courage did an international job search, had the courage to move to a new country and to start again. And is anyone else just moved by that? I'm incredibly moved by that. And the courage that you showed in that job search, we're now seeing in your writing, because if you look at the two books, they are different, and your voice is stronger and more robust because of what I think you've gone through. So let's get into this robust book and why it was time to write a woman's history of the Beatles. Now, as we all know, our shelves are filled, mine at home are filled with stories of insiders on the Beatles, outsiders on the Beatles, hangers-on on the Beatles, people that served Ringo Starr a beer in 1962, they've written a book. Now, you refer to this book as, quote, a fresh look at a well-known story, and indeed you finished your conclusion with the question, why a woman's history of the Beatles? So can I pin you down, answer your own question?
Yes. So it was actually quite surprising to me that something like this hadn't been done already. And as one of my senior colleagues at Griffith said, you need to do this now, because if you don't, someone else will. And I thought, yeah, this is the book I've been waiting all my life to write.
Oh, wow. That's oh, sweetheart. Oh, wow. Oh, darling. Isn't that an amazing moment? I'll get upset too. This is unbelievable. So that's why books matter, because they are a punctuation in somebody's life. They are, your career is leading into, you've put your whole life into this, my darling.
Yes, but I also want to say that there's such a strong presence of really strong women, really amazing women in the Beatles story. Whether you're talking about people who befriended them, their mothers and cousins, people who were very close to them, the women they were romantically involved with, yes, who they married. There's so many wonderful, amazing personalities in the story that certainly have been discussed and talked about, but I just wanted to give a clear path and to really foreground those voices and showcase them and highlight them. And that's something, even though certainly there are wonderful memoirs that have been written by Patty Boyd, by Cynthia Lennon, but I really wanted there to be a book that featured the dynamic nature of women in the Beatles story and the variety of women involved in the story. And so why a women's history of the Beatles? Well, because it needed to be written.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about the diversity of women in this story, and you capture that diversity incredibly, I think. But I also wanted to log something that makes this book quite remarkable, as someone who works in popular cultural studies, is there are profound intellectual difficulties. And when I say profound, there's several expletives I could put in front of that word profound. Real difficulties in managing and aligning fan histories and scholarly histories. Colleagues, that is incredibly difficult to do, right? Because you're managing a crazy multimodality. Now, you've done that. You've managed the intellectual, the scholarly, and the fan voices better than anyone I've ever seen. Did you have a technique for that? How did you manage that without resorting to Henry Jenkins' Acker fan in 1993?
Gosh, that is a really good question, and I'm not sure that I have any clear answer to that. I felt with this project it was very intuitive. I felt just that, first of all, using a lot of primary sources, and I know you have another question, I think, about the interviews, but just that idea of letting the information that I was getting through the interviews lead the narrative, and really trying to find narratives for each chapter and each facet of this history. I just wanted the sources to speak to me and lead me in the right direction. So I have to say I'm not the most strict with methodology. I'm a bit all over the place, but it comes together in a way that works.
And can I say again, she is certainly underestimating herself. If I was answering that question, which I will because I wrote it, when I read this book, why I think you handle it so well, to be honest with you, was somebody who read it as a scholar, and you did better than anybody I've ever seen do it. It's because you started the project with a commitment to women in the plural. You were not looking for a woman's voice or a feminist voice. You were prepared to commit to the diversity wherever it would take you.
Yeah, I think it's more a commitment to trying to put together a narrative that's true and that's real as best as I can represent that.
Yes.
And I've stayed in touch with all the women I interviewed.
Yes.
And have formed really, I think, wonderful and probably lasting connections with most of the women I interviewed, because I just wanted there to be a lot of respect given to them, to all of them. And so I think if anything led the project, it was that ethos behind it.
And if that isn't a great definition of research ethics, I'm not sure what is. And look, again, I'm sorry to ask, I'll keep asking the stroppy questions because I'm the most stroppy feminist anybody's met,
Great
probably.
Questions,
but
great questions.
I just wanted to ask about the complex spaces between a woman's history and a feminist history. Now, you chose women's history of the Beatles, not a stroppy feminist's guide to the Beatles, which would have been my choice. But so much of the female presence in the Beatles' history involves, the glamorous girlfriends. So we've got Jane Archer, we've got Patty Boyd, who I'm a huge fan of, but also the controversial wives, so Linda Eastman, and the legend that is the great Yoko Ono.
Who also recently celebrated her birthday.
Yes, and look, Yoko Ono's still alive, there's hope for all of us.
Yes.
But also those complicated histories of those early wives. So Cynthia Lennon and Maureen Starr is the greatest examples, I think. So how are these women handled in this history? And do you think a feminist reclamation of these women can occur?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I was thinking of writing that chapter, and again, in full respect of each woman, and certainly I didn't interview them, and so I was going off primary sources and also memoirs and biographies, and I was trying to think, how can I tell a different type of story about them that fits within a women's history and maybe has a bit of a feminist reading of what's going on. And actually, it came to me almost magically one day, thinking about how in 1970, the year the Beatles broke up, there was the first article from a literary scholar in the States talking about the meaning of fairy tales for women, and it was a feminist framing of fairy tales. And she was saying that essentially fairy tales show how strong girls can be, how resilient. They're not just stories about the princess finding her prince.
Because Prince Charming is always the disappointment.
But it also got me thinking about the whole fairy tale framing of the Beatles themselves.
Huge.
But how,
Huge.
you know, the Beatles weren't just these Maud Prince Charmings who were in Tiger Beat and Teen Beat and all these magazines for adolescent and teenage girls.
Yeah.
But they also, in their lyrics and the way they addressed women, they showed the understanding of the princess position, if you will. So they were also portrayed as cinder lads who had these humble origins, and they became the princes, right?
Wow.
So it got me thinking in all these different directions about the power of those, because the Beatles' story for us has become this fairy tale, this tale that gets told again and again and again, and that we celebrate this wonderful story of the Beatles. It is a fairy tale for our time, and one that will last and probably only grow stronger as we move into the future. And so I was thinking about what that meant also for the women who came into the Beatles' orbit and were their girlfriends or married them, in terms of that fairy tale, that the public at large and the press and the fans all had very strong opinions about who these women should be. And some of them, and the way that the women were also portrayed in the press at the time, the stories that really intrigued me, because I felt they hadn't been given a lot of attention, were around Jane Asher and Pattie Boyd. And quite respectfully, Jane Asher has never spoken about her relationship with Paul McCartney. And so I wanted also to be very respectful writing about her, I mean all of the women. But what I thought was so interesting about Pattie and Jane's story is that they were presented in all the teen magazines as the ideal young women of the time. Because not only, and it wasn't just about being girlfriends to Paul and George, but that they had these amazingly exciting careers, that they were go ahead, get with it, you know, cool London birds who were doing all these amazing things. And so, of course, then they were portrayed as being the ideals in many respects. So when you have Linda Eastman and Yoko Ono come into the story, I think part of the negative press around them was they didn't fit that storybook fairy tale image. Of course, they did fit the storybook fairy tale image for John and Paul. They were the most beautiful, wonderful women in the world. But you know, the public and the press, for various reasons, just were so harsh to them because they didn't fit this image, this expectation of who a Beatle wife or Beatle girlfriend should be. So the fairy tale frame worked incredibly well, while of course still being very respectful of the women I was writing about. So and Astrid Kershaw, who was not a romantic partner to the four Beatles, but was engaged to the fifth Beatle, Stuart Sutcliffe, who tragically died in 1962, I felt that she took on this other really amazing role as fairy godmother to the Beatles.
And complete style icon as well.
Because I felt she granted them this new view of the world that was magical and expansive.
Yeah, and it is a great example. So those earlier girlfriends are clearly about a women's history of the Beatles, when you're suddenly dealing with Yoko Ono, some very edgy feminism starts to enter this story. And of course, the treatment that she went through demonstrates a great deal about racism in the United Kingdom at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, you know, that chapter is the one, I didn't mention this before, sorry about that, but that is the chapter where the relationship between women's history and feminist history, I think, is the strongest in some respects. Mainly because I was hearkening back to that literature from the early 70s, again, fitting within that time period of the Beatles breakup and the aftermath of the solo careers, which, by the way, I think it's amazing that two men who were in the biggest bands in the world decided to become questing princes and heroes together with their wives and create these new creative projects.
Astonishing.
I think that says so much also about the men involved.
Oh, look, it does. It says a great deal about the complexity of the women. But I want to ask a question about men, because I'm completely, obviously, fixated about men, masculinity, and the history of men. So I want to talk about Beatlemania. So when men are fans of popular music, it's always terribly earnest, right? So play some Skinner, man, right? Think about the Deadheads. And, you know, serious. So men are fans of Dire Straits. It's a very, very serious fandom. It's
very earnest.
We're not smiling. It's very serious. It's about guitars. It's about drums. It's serious. And when we're dealing with women as fans, particularly young women, they're an object of ridicule. So we think about the Bobby Soxers. We think about Beatlemania. The screamers. So what's your take on the disrespect of young female popular music fans?
Well, I think the disrespect comes from a long history of women being seen as irrational, so emotional, hysterical, and that's laid on top of this fan experience. And certainly I'm not the first person to write about this. Will Straw has written about this too, in terms of the connoisseurship that is attached to male fandom.
Yes.
The intellectualizing and knowing all of the statistics and facts about every band. And so I think, you know, many feminists have written about this idea of the tradition of ridiculing women as not being intellectual, not being rational, and that comes through in the fan history. And a real reason why I wanted to write this fan history again is to show that even among those screaming adolescent girls, there is reason, there is a rationale. And also, what's wrong with being emotional anyway? What's wrong with having that emotional response? And I said this to someone else the other day too. But as a communications scholar, that's my background, and I do teach a communication course now, we talk about the rhetorical triangle, that for any good argument you make, for scholarship to be really robust, it can't just be logos, it can't just be about logic and the mind. You have to have pathos, you have to have heart and creativity, and good ethos. So credibility, authority, citing sources appropriately, correctly, all of that, it has to all be there. So I really, and all female fans of anything, should just not stand for that stereotyping, you know? But it does start with the Bobby Soxers and Beatlemania. And so I really wanted to showcase also, first of all, say what's wrong with that. The fact that something has been deemed inappropriate or wrong, that doesn't come from the reality of the experience. That's been put on these girls by men, right? And also to say there's a real intellectual engagement that a lot of women fans have with the Beatles and have always had with the Beatles, and including the Beatlemaniacs. They had their own connection and intellectual engagement in different ways during that time. So I wanted to show more of the stories of those women and girls also, and then show just how complex and multi-layered and multi-dimensional the fan experience has been for women who love the Beatles.
And also, of course, that dreadful rewriting of Beatles history, often after Sgt. Pepper and even after Rubber Soul, really, whereby when young men started to become fans, the Beatles suddenly became more credible.
Right.
And it was a way to rewrite and erase the early Beatlemaniac days. But if you listen to some of those early songs, I'm thinking Help is a great example of that. There's nothing trivial or pathetic in those early songs at all.
No.
They're just treated as trivial because who the fans were.
Right. And the thing is, it also erases the fact that women remained fans of the Beatles into the psychedelic period, into the late period,
Yes.
and many followed their solo careers. And that history hasn't really been talked about either, so I wanted to cover some of that in the book too.
Yes, I need you at some point to explain to me Paul McCartney's Silly Love Songs, because somebody needs to explain that. Because I still, after all this time, that song still confuses me a lot. I want to talk about the specific challenges in writing about the Beatles now, because it's a long time ago now. It's a long time ago from the Cavern Club. It's a lot of time, a lot of space. So why now? I mean, are we post-Beatles? Will we ever be post-Beatles? Shouldn't we be talking about contemporary music now, Christine?
Well, of course, we should do all of it. There should be space for discussions and discourse around all these topics.
Yeah.
I think, well, as I said from the very start, I think this book was a book that needed to be written by someone. If it wasn't me, someone else. It is 60 plus years now since, I mean, the Beatles named themselves the Beatles. They took that moniker on 1960. They went to Hamburg for the first time in 1960. They played over 300 times at the Cavern until August 1963. And, you know, it's important to capture especially the voices of the women who were there at the time.
Indeed.
Who are going into their 70s now. And I think it was the right time to talk about this and to capture this. I mean, maybe you've noticed that there have been a lot of films, both documentary and fictional, talking about women in all these different roles, especially, say, from the 1950s or 60s until now, who have not been talked about, who have been in the shadows, their stories have not really been told. And so I guess I was tapping the zeitgeist in that way, although it wasn't intentional. But I just remember starting to see all these things about, well, what about the women who did this, that, and the other? What about the women who worked at NASA? And, you know.
Remarkable.
So I thought it was finally time that this needed to be done. But I think the fascination with the Beatles grows and grows. I don't think it will ever really go away.
And the interesting part for me is how that legacy changes and transforms. And you captured the remarkable nature of that remarkable port city, Liverpool. Hi to everyone in Liverpool that's watching this. Some of my crew in the northwest of England, hi team. And you captured that great port city and that great time. Now, Liverpool itself has had quite a troubled and complicated, economic journey. And yet, ironically, and I think I wrote an article titled something like when Dinosaurs Roamed the Earth about Liverpool and a Beatles-led recovery. So what's happening with the Beatles and Liverpool now?
Sure. Well, obviously the pandemic has thrown a big wrench into everything, everywhere. And certainly Liverpool tourism has got to be feeling that. But I do follow the Cavern on Facebook, and I know that I think the last big festival, they have International Beatle Week, and they did do it virtually this past year. It's every August, I believe. And I mean, they couldn't be more proud, I think, now of the Beatles as part of the heritage of the city. And when I was there last, which unfortunately now 2016 was the last time I was there. I would love to go back when it's possible again.
We had a life once, Christine.
Remember the before days, Tara?
I'm not sure I can. I'm in Adelaide.
But no, it's very robust. It's very strong. And there's so much love for the Beatles there. And certainly, and I think one of the women I interviewed talked about, and I had heard this from other people too, that certainly there are some Liverpudlians who have heard enough. They're done. They're done with hearing about the Beatles. But there's certainly a very strong pride, strong feeling of pride about all things Beatles. And that does come through in so much of the infrastructure of the city, especially around tourism, obviously. But I, as an American visiting there, the 2 times that I've been there, it lived up to every expectation for me, not only as a Beatles fan, but just what I had heard about how friendly Liverpudlians are and how welcoming and warm. And that was absolutely my experience both times being there.
And it's a tough city, of course, John Lennon Airport. And we should also log in many ways that Paul did return to the city and, of course, found LIPA.
Yes.
The Liverpool Institute of the Performing Arts.
Right.
So he did return. I will only just quickly tell the cavern story. You get a sense of how perhaps at different points Liverpool did not like their Beatles legacy because, of course, the original cavern was demolished for a car park that was never built. And so the current building that's the base of tourism is actually 100 yards on the opposite side of the street. So it's always one of my favourite stories about heritage is we go, what's the cavern is heritage. Is there a more famous club in the world? No. The Beatles left, the Liverpudlians quite rightly said, well, if they've left, it's over. Let's build a car park. It was the 70s, we built a lot of car parks, but then it had to be magically created in a different location. Interesting. And look, we talked about Liverpool. We are in Adelaide, Christine.
Yes.
And welcome to Adelaide. Australia
I do love it.
has a very important part in Beatlemania and the history of women and the Beatles through the 1964 tour. But of course, Adelaide has a crucial part of this history because some of the most famous footage ever of Beatlemania exists from this city, where the city shut down with fans. So you made a great point in the book about the British fandom being very different from the US fandom. Any comments while you're sitting in Adelaide about the differences of the fandom in this country, where it was one moment of peak in 1964 and it looked different to me? What's your scholarly view on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because, first of all, the effort to get the Beatles to play in Adelaide was a grassroots effort. There was a lot of letter writing involved. There was a lot of passion from the fans, some of whom their families had just recently emigrated to Australia. And so there was actually a sizable population of Liverpudlians who had recently come and settled in Adelaide. I think a lot of the a lot of the fathers were working at the car plants in Elizabeth outside of
Do you
Adelaide.
remember manufacturing anyone?
And so there was this big crowd of people who had just moved to the other side of the world, but were very proud. Suddenly, the Beatles really gave them an extra reason to be especially proud of where they'd come from. And they wanted to share that with their new friends here in Adelaide in Australia. And so it was very moving this morning to see Town Hall, where I've seen that footage of the Beatles waving and they're gobsmacked looking at the street just totally rammed to the gills with teenagers and the whole city out to see them. And it's interesting because obviously Australia is part of the Commonwealth still, and there's this closeness between, especially at that time, between Britain and Australia. So it was, here are our British cousins we're so proud of coming to Australia. They're coming all the way to see us. Whereas I think in the US, they always say the US and Britain has always had a special relationship, because we broke away as colonials so early in the story. But I would say that most all Americans I know have at least a bit of being an Anglophile. So I think when the Beatles came to the US, there was something magical about their accents people didn't differentiate between the Queen's English and Liverpudlian accents. Most people didn't. And so there was this idea of, oh, don't they sound elegant? They're so stately. Wow. And, they have castles in England. And there were all these magical, dreamy associations with England for Americans. Not all Americans, mind you, but I would say a sizable chunk of the youth, for sure, thought that was such a wonderful aspect of the Beatles, was that they were from England.
And also, Christine, I think there's a fascinating component about the Ed Sullivan Show in that too. So in many ways, the US history was framed through television.
That's right.
And I think probably the Australian history and also the Kiwi, the Aotearoa New Zealand history, started with the music. And I think that also might be a different bit too. But I did want to hurtle quickly to the interviews. Now, for me, this is a remarkable book. It's, as I've said, it is my book of 2021. It could be my book of the decade. I think it's that good. I think it's that good. And one of the reasons it's that good is you courageously, in a time when very few people do the deep interviews, the deep oral history interviews, you did those interviews. Now, tell us, for all the PhD students out there and the researchers that go, I just want to do a survey. I want to do a sociology semi-structured interview. I want to do, I want to just give me a survey. If I can't do a survey,
focus groups.
Yeah. You said that I might need to be medicated. Yes. Oh, wow. You went to focus groups. Yeah. So let's pretend you didn't say that so I can breathe. But that's right. Instead of choosing what I would argue are the easier methodologies, you chose interviews, deep interviews, and it made a difference. Tell us about interviews in this book.
Sure. I mean, I think I said at the beginning that even with the first book I wrote, and of course it came from the PhD, that I was trained by a media historian. He wasn't out doing oral histories, but he really felt strongly that with even the book on mods, that to tell the whole story, you need to have as many primary sources as possible, and preferably, if you're talking about contemporary history, that you actually go to the people who were involved so they can share their stories and you just get a fuller picture of what's going on or what happened. And so there was never a doubt in my mind, especially if I was going to be talking about another even bigger cultural phenomenon, that it should be something where and the whole idea of foregrounding women's voices and diverse voices meant that I needed as much as I could to try to connect with women and interview them. The interviews ran probably between, I think there were only a few that were about half an hour. I would say most ran between 45 minutes and 90 minutes.
Nice.
There were some women decided to do email interviews, but I would say out of the 60 or so, probably 40 plus were either in person or by Skype. So
there it is.
It was, and I have to say, for anyone who hasn't done this kind of research, for me, it's always the most fun because I learned so much, not just specific to the questions I'm asking, but just about people in general. I think if you're somebody who's fascinated with people's stories and with people's lives, it is just the most fulfilling way to do research, and it's such, I felt really emotional after every interview actually, because I felt so touched by the stories that these women were sharing with me, and I felt a connection with each person I interviewed. So, and I did really try to keep that energy and keep that feeling as I was doing the writing. And so I just think it's the most worthwhile kind of research you can do if you are conducting a project that is centered around cultural history.
So well said, and you handle it brilliantly. We don't talk enough about research ethics, about respect for the people that are gifting us their stories. And what we're getting from Christine is the deep respect involved in that way after the interview. So it's not simply they've signed a waiver, thanks very much, you can use the testimony. This is a deep long-term relationship.
Yeah, and I felt also, even for instance with the wives and girlfriends, I wasn't able to interview them. So I paid that same respect to women who have had interviews published elsewhere that I thought excerpts should be brought in. I just wanted to handle everything with the utmost respect for all the people involved and produce something that they would be happy with as well.
Beautiful. Last couple of questions, if I can. And look, I did want to log, particularly since we're conducting this session in my favourite institution in the universe, which is the library. The library is the cranium of a culture. We need them. We need librarians. They change our lives. But I just wanted to note, with our librarian colleagues in the room too, your footnotes are excellent. I love your footnotes, and it is the best bibliography I have seen in 20 years. Love me a big bibliography. Size matters. Bibliography, big. Thanks. Now, it's so rare these days. So why did you decide to go hard and give us those expansive footnotes? Why did you decide to go hard and give us this intellectually generous bibliography?
Well, isn't that the way you have to do it?
I'm going to start crying.
Well, it's funny because this wonderful historian who I spoke with last weekend, Erin Weber, she's in Kansas in the United States. She's written one of the best books on the Beatles called The Beatles and the Historians that came out in 2016. I highly recommend it. It was the first time I'd spoken with her. We had a call on Zoom preparing for our live event, and she told me how much she loved the footnotes, the endnotes, and it was interesting to me because I went well over word count for the manuscript and had to actually pare back the notes and the actual text and the chapters. So I was really pleased to hear from you and from Erin that the notes really said something to you and to her, that there was enough, meat in there. There was a lot of it. But I feel you need to give that to your readers. You need to show them, this is what I've been doing in trying to figure out what this all means. And here are some extra vitamins to go with the meal. So that's how I think about it. And that was just the way I was trained as a PhD student, that is essential. You have to provide all that reference to what you're talking about. How did you figure this out? How did you know about this, this, and this? You have to provide that information.
And to quote the great philosopher Billy Joel, don't go changing. Okay, so last question before I hand it back to the legendary Prashant, the Jedi Knight of this campus. Now, I just want to ask your advice to others, if I can, Christine, for all the doctoral students out there, for all the early career researchers out there who we neglect terribly in our universities. What did you learn about writing this second book, and how do you think your career has changed through committing to writing this second book?
Well, that's an unfolding story. It remains to be seen, but I feel changed by the project. Because I think it's easy for anyone in any profession to go through peaks and troughs and to sometimes maybe have a crisis of confidence. And I think the best way to get past that is to really commit to a project you absolutely love and are committed to, and choose a topic that is meaningful for you, and not just choose something because you think you have to or it's good for your career, blah, blah, blah. To just really commit to a project where you want to start a conversation, you want to contribute to culture. And so it's meant a lot to me. I have to say, I felt kind of terrified the whole way through, in a way. I mean, I was really, as I said before, the research end of things gave me so much joy, and I really loved that whole part of it. And the writing also, I love writing. And I was really in the zone with writing everything. But it was the first time I was taking on a huge project like that where I didn't have this massive support from, say, my PhD supervisor. So even though I would talk with people about things, and there were a few people who kindly looked at drafts and gave me feedback, I still felt like I was on this journey by myself, and there was a lot to do, and I had committed to it, and I wanted it to turn out well. And so it wasn't easy. I won't say that it was easy. It was definitely challenging, and it challenged me in a lot of ways, both personally and professionally. So I'm speechless sometimes when I hear people like yourself really love the book, people who endorse the book. I'm so happy that it already is getting a very positive reception, but it was not always a cakewalk, or it was never a cakewalk. It was quite challenging the whole way through, even with choosing something I was totally committed to, totally loved, felt that I could do the research, could do the writing. But I think when you take on a big project, it is going to have you will have those moments of self-doubt, what have you.
And look, Prashant, we're about to move back to you. This has been, I didn't know what we'd do today. I didn't know what would happen. It's an interview about a book, but this has been an interview about a woman. It's been an interview about a research project, but it's been an interview about why research matters and why committing deeply and earnestly to a project in a time of metrics and KPIs and getting an article out quickly and countless citations and Google Scholar, all of that matters, I suppose. But you know what? Today has been a corrective, Christine, for all of us. A reminder about the value of a woman, any researcher, but a woman, digging in, testing herself, committing herself. And the definition of research is you don't know where you're going to end up. And where you've ended up has transformed popular music studies. And that's happened through your courage. Prashant, mate, batter up.
That's very hard to follow. But Professor Tara never leaves me anything to add, but this time I've got something. So while that's a great conclusion, thank you. It's also what matters is that bringing diverse voices to shape the context and the history and bring new stories up. So thank you. And this is, I may not get this opportunity, so I might actually just ask a quick question. So you did mention or were contemplating about why this concept or this book has not been written before. How much of that do you contribute towards research or scholarly debate being managed or done by men, and more that's an issue that's being we are all struggling with that, and there are some positive signs, but there's a lot more work to do. And the second part of that question is, if this was written by a male using the same methodology that you used, how do you see that would have been different?
Well, I do wonder what the feeling would be between interviewer and interviewee in that context. And because I was coming not only from a scholarly position, but a fan position as well, there was that meeting of minds I felt when I was interviewing the women who are featured in the book, that even if we were different generations, we were female fans of the Beatles, even though I was coming from this observational, scholarly perspective as well, and asking particular questions, but I felt that it was very relaxed and friendly, all the interviews. And I just, I wonder how that would change, having a slightly different connection between interviewer and interviewee, and talking about women's perspectives and not being a woman researcher, right? So I think something would change. And, even the study of any topic in popular culture, popular music, it's really only since the mid-60s where there's been a build-up to that being acceptable. And I do write about this in one of the chapters of the book, that the reason why maybe you didn't hear women's voices in academia writing about the Beatles sooner than, say, the 1990s is because women were still struggling in academia to be taken seriously at all in even more traditional topics or subject matter or disciplines, So to be a woman trying to get a leg up in any sort of male-dominated industry or profession, I think there's always that overcorrection of, I'm not allowed to study something like the Beatles because, yeah, you're a girl, you would do that. What are you studying, Beatlemania? What are you doing? And so I think women scholars, I don't know, and I can't speak for other scholars, but I do wonder if there's been a hesitation to talk about the gender issue because of not wanting to be stereotyped as a scholar or something like that. I don't know. But in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even when I was studying the mods as a doctoral candidate, nobody could believe that I got a Fulbright to study mods in Germany. They thought that was crazy. A lot of people couldn't believe my luck. I was the first person ever to get a Fulbright at the University of Pittsburgh in the communication department.
Wow.
And that was, of course, validation for me that I was onto something. But I just think things can be slow to change. And so do I think this book should have been written in 1990, sure, or 1975, why not? Why wasn't it written then? But it's just, things are so slow to change and progress.
The trivial is political. Prashant.
So thank you for asking those questions.
Gender issues come into our day-to-day things from different sides, and we struggle with that. I believe that things are progressing, however they are very slow. So thank you for bringing that women perspective, and I think it's good that this concept waited for you to come along, because I think others would have struggled to do justice to that voice. So thanks a lot. So my final question to the panel, and I will start with my own take-home message. So if you have to give take-home message to the audience, what would that be? I will start by what touched me the most was you had a vision. You knew that you wanted a book out of this. What you shaped through your PhD, or at least that's what I got out of your responses, was just the path rather than the vision. So that's my take home from there, and perseverance, of course. No matter what happens, you just persevere. So what are your take home messages, you and Tara?
Want me to go first?
Sure.
I was in a university meeting last Thursday, and someone tried to explain to the committee that a refereed article is equivalent in research value to a singly authored scholarly monograph. 7,000 word article is equivalent to an 80,000 word singly authored monograph. And I was the person in that meeting, I was the only person in that meeting who stated that that was a false equivalence and it is offensive. And we learn a great deal about what's happened to the humanities and the social sciences in this country, that a singly authored scholarly monograph, a life's work, and what Christine has shown us today, this matters. This is this woman's being that's been expressed here. Most of us write 5-10 refereed articles a year, but the book matters. The book is your punctuation of your life. And you know what? It's the punctuation point of knowledge. And may we never forget that, or undermine that or create an equivalence to a refereed article. Refereed articles are great. The book matters.
Wow.
I'm speechless with that passion. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you for
absolutely
saying that, Tara.
profound. Christine.
I would say that as hard as it may feel sometimes to just follow your path and stay true to yourself, because that's the only way to do it. I think that's really the only way to be happy doing what you're doing, and that's where good things happen. That's where success really comes in whatever form. Personal fulfillment, adding to the cultural conversation, enhancing your teaching if you're a lecturer or professor, to really stay true to what's important to you, and to pass that message along, pay it forward, to mentor others, to follow their own vision. I think that's really the most important thing.
Beautiful.
Great, thank you. We may have time for one last question. Anybody?
Thank you both for a fantastic opportunity to bear witness to what was a truly remarkable conversation. So mine is more a comment than a question, but I would also just share my deep appreciation for your scholarship, Christine. Thank you so much for what you have shared with us as a scholar in developing your book. Tara is right, but I would say that, being a librarian, the book does matter. The long form matters. It reaches us as readers and sparks our intellectual curiosity as a writer. It's that direct connection that we have that speaks to the future as well. So thank you for providing that legacy and that material for us to take into the future.
Thank you so much.
And I can assure you that your book is in back order to be inducted into the library. So we will be getting the book very soon and shortly for our academics and our students.
Fantastic.
So, great. Thank you, Tara and Christine, for sharing your time and knowledge. What a wonderful conversation. I've got so many different threads that I can pursue, and I will be pursuing and trying to engage with you too as the time goes. For our audience, remember you can watch this session again on the Flinders YouTube channel or Flinders University webpage. It's been recorded. And thank you again for your interest and attendance. Thank you all.
You're a rock star. Thanks, mate.
And now that I've got a witness, it's greyed out. Yeah, should I pause it again? Is it streaming?